Long before the great cities of Europe had risen to prominence, before the Americas were explored by distant continents, and centuries before the modern world took shape, there existed on the vast steppes of Mongolia a collection of nomadic tribes whose way of life had remained unchanged for thousands of years. These were the Mongols, a people intimately connected to their horses, their herds, and the endless grasslands that stretched beyond every horizon. Yet from these humble beginnings would emerge the largest contiguous land empire in human history, an empire that would fundamentally reshape the world and connect civilizations in ways that had never been possible before. The story of the Mongol Empire begins not with grand palaces or mighty cities, but with the windswept plains of the Mongolian steppes, where the rhythm of life followed the seasons and the migration patterns of livestock. Here, under the vast dome of sky that seemed to touch the earth at every edge, lived scattered tribes of herders who measured wealth not in gold or silver, but in horses, sheep, goats, and the hardy yaks that could survive the brutal winters of the high plateau. These steppes themselves shaped every aspect of Mongol life and culture. The grasslands stretched for thousands of miles, broken only by occasional rivers, mountain ranges, and the scattered oases that provided crucial resources during the long migrations that defined nomadic existence. The climate was harsh and unpredictable, with scorching summers that could parch the grass and deadly winters that brought temperatures far below freezing and winds that could kill an exposed traveler within hours. Yet this seemingly hostile environment had produced a people uniquely adapted to its demands. The Mongols had developed an intimate understanding of weather patterns, seasonal changes, and the subtle signs that indicated the best grazing areas, water sources, and shelter locations. They could read the sky like a book, predicting storms, cold snaps, and seasonal changes with accuracy that often meant the difference between prosperity and disaster for their herds and families. The foundation of Mongol society was the relationship between humans and animals, particularly horses. Mongol children learned to ride almost before they could walk, developing a bond with their mounts that was both practical and spiritual. Horses provided transportation, military capability, food, and even drink, as fermented mare's milk became a staple beverage known as arag or kumis. The quality and number of a family's horses determined their status, mobility, and survival prospects in the demanding environment of the steppes. But horses were only part of a complex pastoral economy that included sheep for wool and meat, goats for milk and fiber, cattle for strength and sustenance, and yaks for survival in the highest and coldest regions. Managing these diverse herds required sophisticated knowledge of animal behavior, grazing requirements, and seasonal movements. Successful herders needed to understand not just their own animals, but the complex ecological relationships that governed grassland health, water availability, and the carrying capacity of different regions during different seasons. The social structure of these early Mongol tribes reflected the demands of nomadic life and the constant need for flexibility in the face of changing conditions. Leadership was often situational rather than hereditary, with different individuals taking charge based on the specific challenges facing the community. A man might lead during times of war for his tactical brilliance and courage, while another might guide the tribe's movements based on his knowledge of grazing lands, weather patterns, and the locations of resources and dangers. Women held significant influence within tribal structures, managing many aspects of daily life and often participating in crucial decisions about tribal movements, alliances, and resource allocation. They were responsible for the complex logistics of moving entire households across vast distances, maintaining the specialized equipment needed for nomadic life, and preserving the cultural knowledge that bound communities together across generations. Mongol women were also skilled in traditional crafts, particularly the production of felt, leather goods, and the intricate decorative work that adorned clothing, horse gear, and dwelling furnishings. The spiritual life of the early Mongols was deeply connected to their environment and way of life. They practiced a form of shamanism that recognized spirits in natural features like mountains, rivers, and unusual rock formations, as well as in the animals that shared their world. The eternal blue sky, or Tengri, was considered the supreme spiritual force governing all aspects of life and death. This spiritual system provided both practical guidance for daily life and philosophical framework for understanding their place in the natural world. Yet for all their skills and resilience, the Mongol tribes of the 12th century lived in a state of almost constant conflict with one another. The steppes, while vast, could not support unlimited populations in any given area, and competition for the best grazing lands, water sources, and strategic positions led to frequent warfare between different groups. These conflicts were often intensified by cycles of drought, harsh winters, or other environmental pressures that reduced the resources available to support tribal populations. The nature of these conflicts reflected both the military capabilities of steppe peoples and the specific conditions of nomadic life. Raids were swift and devastating, with mounted warriors appearing suddenly to capture livestock, take prisoners, or eliminate threats before disappearing back into the vastness of the grasslands. Traditional Mongol warfare emphasized mobility, surprise, and the ability to live off the land during extended campaigns, skills that would later prove invaluable when the Mongols turned their attention beyond their traditional territories. Disputes often centered around practical concerns like grazing rights, water access, and the theft of livestock, but they were frequently complicated by ancient feuds, marriage alliances gone wrong, and the complex web of obligations and rivalries that connected different tribal groups. The oral tradition of the Mongols preserved detailed genealogies and historical narratives that kept alive grievances and claims spanning multiple generations, ensuring that conflicts often had deep historical roots that made resolution particularly difficult. These constant conflicts, while limiting the potential of individual tribes and preventing the development of larger political units, also served as a crucible that forged exceptional warriors and leaders. The harsh realities of steppe warfare, the need for split-second tactical decisions, the importance of unit cohesion under extreme stress, and the requirement for leaders who could inspire absolute loyalty and confidence created a military culture that valued practical competence over theoretical knowledge and personal courage over inherited status. The traditional weapons of the steppes reflected both the demands of mounted warfare and the technological capabilities of nomadic peoples. The composite bow was the primary weapon, a sophisticated piece of technology that could deliver arrows with devastating accuracy and power at considerable distances. Mongol warriors also carried sabers, lances, and various specialized weapons for close combat, all designed to be effective while mounted and mobile. Defensive equipment was typically light but effective, allowing for maximum mobility while providing essential protection in combat. Military tactics on the steppes had evolved over centuries of intertribal warfare to emphasize the natural advantages of mounted nomadic peoples. The feigned retreat was a standard tactic, drawing enemy forces out of defensive positions and into terrain favorable for encirclement and destruction. The use of multiple coordinated units operating over vast areas allowed for complex strategic maneuvers that could confuse and overwhelm opponents. The ability to maintain communications and coordination across great distances through sophisticated signaling systems and messenger networks was a crucial tactical advantage. It was into this world of tribal conflict, environmental challenge, and nomadic tradition that a child was born around 1162 near the Onon River in what is now Mongolia. This child, originally named Temujin, would grow to become Genghis Khan, the great unifier of the Mongol tribes and founder of an empire that would span from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. But his path to power was neither straight nor simple, and understanding his early life provides crucial insight into both the man he became and the empire he would create. Temujin's birth occurred during a period of particular turmoil among the Mongol tribes, with various groups engaged in complex conflicts that shifted alliances and loyalties with bewildering frequency. His father, Yasuge, was a minor tribal leader of the Borjigin clan, a group that claimed descent from a legendary wolf and deer, who were said to be the ancestors of all Mongols. This mythical ancestry provided the Borjigin with a degree of prestige, but it did not guarantee them security or prosperity in the volatile world of steppe politics. The circumstances surrounding Temujin's birth were themselves emblematic of the violent and uncertain nature of tribal life. According to Mongol tradition, he was born clutching a blood clot in his fist, an omen that shamans interpreted as a sign that he would become a great warrior and leader. Whether or not this particular detail is historically accurate, it reflects the importance that Mongol culture placed on signs and portents, as well as the expectation that future leaders would be marked by exceptional characteristics from birth. Yasuge's position as a tribal leader meant that young Temujin was exposed from an early age to the complexities of steppe politics and the challenges of leadership in a fractured and competitive environment. He would have witnessed negotiations between tribal leaders, participated in the complex ceremonies and rituals that governed tribal relationships, and observed the delicate balance of cooperation and competition that characterized interactions between different groups. When Temujin was still quite young, probably around 9 years old, his father arranged a marriage alliance with a more powerful tribe, the Angarat, taking his son to live with his future bride's family, according to traditional custom. This arrangement was typical of the strategic marriages that tribal leaders used to build alliances and secure favorable relationships with neighboring groups. Such alliances were crucial for survival in the competitive world of the steppes, providing mutual defense pacts, access to additional grazing areas, and the complex web of obligations and support that could mean the difference between prosperity and disaster. However, on the journey back from arranging this marriage, Yasuge was poisoned by rival Tatars, traditional enemies of the Mongols, who had long-standing grievances against the Borjigin clan. His death left young Temujin's family vulnerable and without protection in the harsh political landscape of the steppes. The traditional allies of Yasuge quickly abandoned his widow and children, viewing them as a burden rather than an asset in the constant struggle for survival and dominance that characterized tribal life. This abandonment marked the beginning of perhaps the most formative period of Temujin's life, a time of hardship and struggle that would profoundly influence his later approach to leadership, loyalty, and the organization of power. Reduced to near poverty, he and his family struggled to survive in a world where protection and resources were closely linked to political alliances and military strength. They were forced to move frequently to avoid enemies and former rivals who might see them as easy targets for raids or revenge attacks. During this period of displacement and hardship, Temujin's family lived on the margins of tribal society, subsisting on fishing, hunting small game, and gathering wild foods, and activities that were considered beneath the dignity of proper nomadic herders, but necessary for survival when traditional support networks had collapsed. This experience of social marginalization and economic desperation provided Temujin with insights into the lives of those who existed outside the traditional tribal power structures, knowledge that would later inform his innovative approaches to building loyalty and organizing political support. The hardships of this period were not merely economic, but also social and psychological, in a culture that placed enormous emphasis on honor, status, and the complex web of relationships that defined one's place in society. The fall from minor nobility to near outcast status was devastating. Temujin experienced firsthand the arbitrary nature of traditional tribal loyalties, the vulnerability of the weak in a society organized around strength and military capability, and the importance of personal relationships based on mutual benefit rather than abstract obligations. Perhaps most significantly, these years of struggle taught Temujin to value practical competence over hereditary status and to build loyalty through demonstrated results rather than traditional claims to authority. He learned to evaluate people based on their abilities and commitment rather than their family connections, a revolutionary approach in a society where bloodlines had traditionally determined status and opportunity. This meritocratic philosophy would become one of the defining characteristics of the Mongol Empire, allowing it to incorporate and utilize talent from across the vast territories it would eventually control. The young Temujin's rise from this difficult beginning was marked by a series of alliances, betrayals, captures, and escapes that read like an epic tale of adventure and survival. Each of these experiences contributed to his understanding of leadership, loyalty, and the mechanics of power that would later serve him as he unified the fractured Mongol tribes under his rule. His early adulthood was characterized by a gradual accumulation of followers and influence, achieved through a combination of personal charisma, military success, and the ability to provide security and opportunity to those who joined his cause. One of the most important relationships of Temujin's early career was his friendship and later rivalry with Jamukha, a childhood companion who would become one of his most formidable opponents in the struggle for supremacy among the Mongol tribes. Their relationship illustrates many of the complexities of tribal politics and the personal nature of leadership in nomadic society. Initially allies and blood brothers, they eventually became enemies as their ambitions and approaches to leadership diverged, representing different visions of how Mongol society should be organized and led. The conflict between Temujin and Jamukha was not simply a personal rivalry, but represented fundamental differences in approach to tribal organization and leadership. Jamuka represented the traditional aristocratic approach, basing his claims to leadership on his noble birth and his connections to established tribal hierarchies. Temujin, by contrast, built his following through personal loyalty, shared success, and the promise of advancement based on merit rather than birth. This philosophical difference would have profound implications for the future development of Mongol society and the empire that emerged from tribal unification. As Temujin's influence grew, he demonstrated remarkable skill in building coalitions and managing the complex web of relationships that characterize steppe politics. He formed strategic alliances with powerful tribal leaders like Togrul Khan of the Karaks, using these relationships to build his military strength while carefully maintaining his independence and avoiding becoming merely a subordinate to more established powers. These alliances provided him with the resources and legitimacy needed to challenge other claimants to tribal leadership while teaching him valuable lessons about diplomacy, negotiation, and the management of complex political relationships. Perhaps most importantly, Temujin's early struggles and gradual rise to power taught him to think systematically about the organization of military and political power, rather than relying on traditional tribal structures that were often based on kinship and ancient precedent. He began to develop new organizational approaches that emphasized efficiency, loyalty, and the optimal use of available resources. These innovations would later become the foundation for the military and administrative systems that made Mongol expansion possible. The process of building his following also exposed Temujin to the diverse populations that lived on the margins of traditional Mongol society: displaced individuals, ambitious younger sons with limited opportunities in traditional hierarchies, skilled craftsmen, and specialists who could contribute valuable expertise, and members of defeated tribes who sought new opportunities for advancement. By incorporating these diverse groups into his organization, Temujin began to create a more inclusive and flexible social structure that would later prove crucial for governing the diverse populations of a vast empire. By the early 1200s, Temujin had emerged as one of the most powerful leaders among the Mongol tribes, but he still faced significant rivals and the constant challenge of maintaining unity among groups that had been fighting each other for generations. The final phase of tribal unification required not just military victories, but also a fundamental reimagining of Mongol society and identity. Temujin needed to transform a collection of often hostile tribes into a unified people with shared goals and loyalties that transcended traditional clan boundaries. The methods he used to achieve this unification reveal much about his genius as both a military leader and a political organizer, rather than simply conquering opposing tribes and ruling them as subjects. Temujin often incorporated defeated enemies into his own forces, particularly those who had fought bravely or demonstrated valuable skills. This policy of incorporation rather than elimination helped build the manpower needed for larger military operations, while reducing the potential for future rebellion by giving former enemies a stake in his success. The reorganization of Mongol society that Temujin implemented went far beyond simple military considerations. He broke up traditional tribal structures that might serve as focal points for resistance, instead organizing his followers into decimal units, groups of 10, 100,000, and 10,000 warriors that cut across old tribal lines and created new loyalties based on shared service and success. This decimal system was not merely a military innovation, but a comprehensive social reorganization that created new identities and relationships that superseded traditional clan loyalties. The decimal organization system had several important advantages beyond its military applications. It created clear command structures that could function effectively across large distances and diverse populations. It provided a framework for the distribution of resources and responsibilities that was based on demonstrated capability rather than traditional status. It also created opportunities for advancement that were available to individuals from any background, helping to build loyalty and motivation throughout the organization. This reorganization of Mongol society extended beyond military matters to encompass legal, economic, and cultural systems. Temujin established laws and customs that applied to all his followers, regardless of their tribal origins, creating a unified legal and social framework that helped bind together the diverse groups under his command. The Great Law, or Yasa, that he promulgated covered everything from military discipline and the treatment of prisoners to trade regulations and religious practices, providing a comprehensive code that could govern the complex society that was emerging from tribal unification. The economic implications of Mongol unification were also significant. Traditional tribal warfare had been largely destructive, with raids and conflicts disrupting trade, destroying resources, and preventing the development of larger economic systems. Under unified leadership, the Mongols could begin to develop more systematic approaches to resource management, trade, and economic development. The security provided by unified political control allowed for the expansion of trade networks and the development of more sophisticated economic relationships with neighboring sedentary civilizations. In 1206, at a great assembly known as a Kurultai, the unified Mongol tribes formally recognized Temujin as their supreme leader, granting him the title Genghis Khan, which likely meant universal ruler or oceanic ruler. This moment marked not just the culmination of Temujin's personal rise to power, but the birth of the Mongol Empire as a unified political entity. The scattered tribes of the steppes had become a single people with a shared identity and common purpose, ready to project their power far beyond their traditional grazing lands. The Kurultai that elevated Genghis Khan was itself a remarkable demonstration of the new political system he had created. Representatives from all the major tribal groups that had been incorporated into his following participated in the decision, creating a sense of collective investment in his leadership that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. The ceremony combined traditional Mongol customs with innovations that reflected the new scale and scope of the political entity that was being created. The transformation that Genghis Khan had accomplished among the Mongol tribes was remarkable not just for its military implications, but for its social and cultural impact. He had taken a society organized around kinship and tribal affiliations and restructured it around merit, loyalty, and shared purpose. This new organization would prove to be not just more effective in warfare, but also more adaptable to the challenges of governing diverse populations across vast distances, capabilities that would be essential as the Mongol Empire expanded far beyond the steppes of Mongolia. The military innovations that emerged from Mongol unification represented a synthesis of traditional steppe warfare techniques with organizational innovations that allowed for operations on a much larger scale than had previously been possible. The decimal system provided a framework for coordinating large armies while maintaining the flexibility and mobility that were the traditional strengths of nomadic warriors. The incorporation of diverse tribal groups created armies with varied skills and capabilities that could adapt to different types of terrain and opponents. Perhaps most importantly, the unified Mongol military system emphasized training, discipline, and coordination in ways that had not been possible when individual tribes fought primarily for their own interests. Warriors were trained not just in individual combat skills, but in unit tactics, coordination with other units, and the complex maneuvers required for large-scale military operations. This systematic approach to military training and organization would prove crucial as the Mongols faced increasingly sophisticated opponents beyond the steppes. With the Mongol tribes unified under his leadership, Genghis Khan turned his attention to the sedentary civilizations that surrounded the steppes. These represented both opportunity and challenge of a magnitude that no steppe confederation had previously attempted to address. They possessed wealth, technology, and resources that the Mongols lacked, but they also had defensive advantages, established military traditions, and complex political systems that had evolved over centuries to deal with nomadic threats. The campaigns that followed would test not just Mongol military capabilities, but their ability to adapt their steppe-based tactics and organization to the demands of conquering and governing settled peoples. The transition from tribal unification to imperial expansion required innovations in siege warfare, naval operations, administration of conquered territories, and the integration of diverse populations with different languages, cultures, and political traditions. The first major target of Mongol expansion was the Western Jia Kingdom, located in what is now northwestern China. This campaign served multiple purposes beyond simple conquest. It provided a testing ground for Mongol military tactics against fortified positions and a source of valuable experience in siege warfare, an area where the traditionally mobile Mongols initially lacked expertise. It also served as a training ground for the larger and more complex campaigns that would follow, allowing Mongol commanders to develop new tactics and organizational approaches. The Western Jia campaigns revealed both the strengths and limitations of traditional Mongol warfare, while providing crucial lessons that would inform later conquests. The Mongols discovered that their traditional tactics of rapid movement and encirclement were not immediately effective against walled cities and fortified positions. However, they also demonstrated their characteristic adaptability, quickly learning to employ siege specialists, adopt new technologies, and develop strategies specifically designed for reducing fortified positions. What emerged from these early campaigns was a distinctly Mongol approach to warfare that combined their traditional strengths in mobility and cavalry tactics with innovations adapted from their enemies and incorporated specialists. The Mongols proved remarkably adept at learning from each encounter, adopting new technologies and techniques when they proved useful while maintaining the core advantages that came from their nomadic heritage and unified command structure. The siege warfare techniques that the Mongols developed during the Western Jia campaigns represented a significant evolution in their military capabilities. They learned to employ Chinese and other engineers who could construct siege weapons and developed strategies for breaching walls and overcoming defensive positions. They also developed psychological warfare techniques, using their growing reputation for both military effectiveness and ruthless treatment of those who resisted to encourage surrender without the need for costly siege operations. The integration of siege specialists and engineers into Mongol armies was part of a broader pattern of incorporating useful technologies and expertise from conquered or allied populations. This approach reflected Genghis Khan's pragmatic philosophy that merit and usefulness were more important than ethnic or cultural background. Chinese engineers, Muslim administrators, European craftsmen, and specialists from various backgrounds found opportunities for advancement within the Mongol system based on their abilities rather than their origins. Following the successful campaigns against Western Zhao, Genghis Khan set his sights on the Jin dynasty that controlled northern China. This represented a massive escalation in both the scale and complexity of Mongol military operations. The Jin dynasty was a major power with extensive military resources, sophisticated defensive systems, millions of subjects, and centuries of experience in dealing with nomadic threats. Conquering such an opponent would require not just tactical brilliance, but strategic planning on an unprecedented scale and the ability to coordinate military operations across vast distances and diverse terrains. The campaigns against the Jin dynasty, which began in earnest around 1211, demonstrated the full evolution of Mongol military capabilities under Genghis Khan's leadership. The Mongols had learned to combine their traditional mobility and shock tactics with sophisticated siege techniques, intelligence networks, and psychological warfare. They also demonstrated remarkable strategic patience, conducting systematic campaigns that gradually isolated and weakened their opponents rather than seeking quick, decisive battles that might prove costly or uncertain. The Jin campaigns also revealed the growing sophistication of Mongol approaches to logistics and supply. Traditional nomadic armies lived off the land and could operate with minimal supply trains, but the siege of major cities and extended campaigns in agricultural regions required more complex logistical arrangements. The Mongols developed systems for organizing supply trains, establishing supply depots, and coordinating the movement of resources across vast distances, the capabilities that would prove essential for their later conquests across Eurasia. Perhaps most importantly, these campaigns revealed the Mongols' growing sophistication in dealing with conquered populations. Rather than simply extracting tribute and moving on, they began to establish administrative systems that could govern settled peoples while extracting resources to support continued military operations. This required incorporating local administrators, adapting existing governmental structures, and developing policies that balanced the need for control with the practical requirements of maintaining economic productivity in conquered territories. The administrative innovations that emerged during the Jin campaigns represented a crucial evolution in Mongol governmental capabilities. They learned to work with existing Chinese administrative systems while adapting them to Mongol needs and priorities. They developed new approaches to taxation, population registration, and resource allocation that could function effectively across diverse populations and economic systems. They also began to experiment with the integration of different cultural and administrative traditions, creating hybrid systems that combined Mongol political control with local administrative expertise. The success of the Jin campaigns established the Mongol Empire as a major power in East Asia and demonstrated that the unified tribes of the steppes could not only defeat but actually govern sophisticated sedentary civilizations. This success attracted attention from other powers and created both opportunities and threats that would shape the next phase of Mongol expansion. It also provided Genghis Khan and his commanders with valuable experience in managing the complex challenges of ruling diverse populations across vast territories. The wealth and resources gained from the Jin campaigns also provided the foundation for even more ambitious military operations. The Mongols now had access to Chinese military technology, engineering expertise, and administrative systems that could support operations on a scale that would have been impossible based solely on the resources of the steppes. They also had experience in governing large settled populations and extracting resources from agricultural economies, capabilities that would prove essential for sustaining the extended campaigns that characterized later phases of Mongol expansion. While the campaigns in China continued, Genghis Khan also turned his attention westward toward the Khwarezmid Empire that controlled much of Central Asia and parts of modern-day Iran and Afghanistan. This decision to open a second major front while still engaged in China reflected both the growing confidence of the Mongol leadership and their understanding that their military system was most effective when constantly engaged in active operations that provided opportunities for advancement and enrichment for their followers. The conflict with the Khwarezmid Empire began almost by accident when a Mongol trade mission was attacked and killed on the orders of Inalchuk, the governor of Otrar, in border city of the Khwarezmid Empire. This incident occurred in the context of expanding trade relationships between the Mongol Empire and the settled civilizations to the west, relationships that reflected both Mongol interest in acquiring goods and technologies not available on the steppes and the recognition by settled powers that the unified Mongols represented both a potential threat and a valuable trading partner. Genghis Khan's response to this provocation revealed both his diplomatic sophistication and his understanding of the propaganda value of appearing to seek justice rather than mere conquest. He demanded that the Khwarezmid Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, surrender the governor responsible for the attack and provide compensation for the losses suffered by the trade mission. When this demand was refused and his ambassadors were mistreated, one being killed and the others having their beards shaved off, a grave insult in Islamic culture, he had clear justification for the devastating campaign that followed. The diplomatic exchanges that preceded the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmid Empire demonstrate the growing sophistication of Mongol political and diplomatic practices. Genghis Khan understood the importance of legitimate grievances and proper justification for military action, both for maintaining unity within his own forces and for his reputation among potential enemies and allies. The careful documentation of Khwarezmid insults and provocations provided a narrative framework that portrayed the subsequent invasion as a justified response to unprovoked aggression rather than mere territorial aggrandizement. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmid Empire, beginning around 1219, represented perhaps the most systematic and thorough conquest in military history up to that point. Genghis Khan divided his forces into multiple armies that operated with remarkable coordination across thousands of miles, systematically reducing the major strongholds of the empire while preventing effective resistance or counterattack. The campaign demonstrated not just Mongol military superiority, but their mastery of logistics, intelligence gathering, and strategic planning on a continental scale. The strategic approach to the Khwarezmid campaign reflected lessons learned from earlier conquests and the maturation of Mongol military thinking. Rather than attempting a single massive assault on the empire's heartland, the Mongols conducted a carefully coordinated series of operations that isolated different regions, prevented mutual support between various strongholds, and systematically eliminated the empire's capacity for organized resistance. This approach minimized Mongol casualties while maximizing the psychological impact of their victories. The coordination required for these simultaneous operations across such vast distances demonstrated the effectiveness of the communication and command systems that the Mongols had developed. Messages could be relayed across thousands of miles through networks of mounted messengers, allowing for real-time coordination of military operations and adjustment of strategies based on changing conditions. This communication capability gave the Mongols crucial advantages in strategic flexibility and responsiveness that their enemies could not match. The destruction of the Khwarezmid Empire was so thorough that many of its major cities never fully recovered, and the campaign became legendary for its ruthlessness toward those who resisted and its efficiency in breaking down organized opposition. Cities that surrendered were generally treated with relative leniency, while those that resisted faced complete destruction and the massacre or enslavement of their populations. This policy served both practical and psychological purposes, reducing the costs of conquest while encouraging other potential opponents to surrender rather than face similar fates. Yet even in this campaign, renowned for its destructiveness, the Mongols demonstrated their pragmatic approach to conquest and governance. They preserved and utilized local administrators and specialists who submitted willingly, incorporated useful technologies and practices into their own systems, and maintained the economic infrastructure needed to support continued military operations and future governance. The selective nature of Mongol destruction devastating to military and political resistance, but preserving useful economic and administrative capabilities reflected their sophisticated understanding of the requirements for effective conquest and rule. The Khwarezmid campaigns also brought the Mongols into contact with new types of terrain, enemies, and administrative challenges that further expanded their capabilities and experience. The cities of Central Asia were major commercial centers connected by ancient trade routes, and controlling them required understanding and managing complex economic relationships that extended far beyond traditional Mongol experience. The success of these campaigns established the Mongols as masters of the Silk Road and gave them control over some of the most lucrative trade routes in the world. The economic implications of Mongol control over Central Asian trade routes were profound and long-lasting. These routes had been the primary conduits for trade between East and West for centuries, carrying not just goods, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural influences across the breadth of Eurasia. Under Mongol control, these trade networks experienced unprecedented security and efficiency, leading to a dramatic expansion in commercial activity and cultural exchange. The administrative systems that the Mongols developed for governing conquered territories in Central Asia represented important innovations in imperial governance. They learned to work with existing commercial and administrative networks, while adapting them to serve Mongol interests and priorities. They developed new approaches to taxation and regulation that could function effectively across diverse populations while maintaining the economic productivity that made continued expansion possible. The Western campaigns also brought the Mongol armies into contact with different cultural and religious traditions that would influence the later development of the empire. The Islamic civilization of Central Asia had different legal traditions, administrative practices, and cultural values than the Chinese and nomadic societies that the Mongols had previously encountered. Learning to govern these populations effectively required new approaches to cultural sensitivity and religious tolerance that would become characteristic features of Mongol imperial policy. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the Mongol Empire had grown from a collection of quarreling tribes to the largest contiguous land empire in history. The Great Khan had unified the Mongols, conquered major portions of China, destroyed the Khwarezmid Empire, and established Mongol authority over vast territories stretching from Korea to the Caspian Sea. Yet perhaps even more remarkably, he had created governmental and military systems that could function effectively across this enormous territory and continue expanding even after his death. The governmental innovations that Genghis Khan developed represented a unique synthesis of nomadic traditions with adaptations necessary for governing settled populations. The decimal military organization provided a framework for administration as well as warfare, creating clear hierarchies and communication networks that could function across vast distances. The legal code known as the Yasa provided uniform standards for behavior and governance throughout Mongol territories, while the policy of religious tolerance prevented the kind of cultural conflicts that might have destabilized imperial rule. The administrative genius of Genghis Khan lay not just in his military innovations, but in his ability to create flexible systems that could adapt to diverse local conditions while maintaining overall unity and control. He established communication networks that could relay messages across thousands of miles, legal codes that applied throughout Mongol territories, and administrative practices that incorporated the best features of the various civilizations under Mongol rule. These systems created a foundation for continued expansion and effective governance that would serve his successors well. The economic systems that emerged under Genghis Khan's rule represented another crucial innovation in imperial governance. The Mongols developed new approaches to trade regulation, taxation, and resource allocation that could function effectively across diverse economic systems and cultural traditions. They promoted trade and commercial activity while extracting resources needed to support military operations and imperial administration. They also learned to balance the immediate needs of conquest with the long-term requirements of maintaining productive and stable societies in conquered territories. The death of Genghis Khan marked the end of the first phase of Mongol expansion, but the empire he had created was far from finished growing. According to Mongol custom, his vast territories were divided among his sons, with his third son Ogedei selected as the Great Khan to maintain overall unity and coordination. This succession arrangement reflected Genghis Khan's understanding that the empire had grown too large for direct personal rule, while recognizing the importance of maintaining unified leadership for continued expansion and coordination between different regions. The succession system that Genghis Khan established represented an innovative approach to the challenges of governing vast territories with diverse populations and interests, rather than attempting to maintain direct personal control over all aspects of imperial administration. He created a system of delegated authority that allowed for local adaptation while preserving overall coordination and unity. This system would prove crucial for the continued expansion and effective governance of the empire under his successors. Under Ogedai Khan, who ruled as Great Khan from 1229 to 1241, the Mongol Empire entered perhaps its most dramatic period of expansion and administrative development. Ogedai proved to be an able administrator and military strategist who understood how to coordinate multiple large-scale campaigns while maintaining the administrative systems needed to govern existing territories. His reign saw the completion of the conquest of the Jin dynasty in China, major campaigns into Europe, and the establishment of many of the governmental innovations that would characterize the mature Mongol Empire. Ogedai's approach to imperial governance reflected both continuity with his father's innovations and adaptations to the changing scale and complexity of the empire. He maintained the basic military and administrative structures that Genghis Khan had established while developing new systems for coordination between different regions and more sophisticated approaches to taxation, trade regulation, and cultural management. Under his leadership, the Mongol Empire became not just a military confederation, but a complex governmental system capable of administering diverse populations across multiple continents. The completion of the Jin conquest under Ogedai's leadership was significant, not just for its military achievements, but for what it revealed about Mongol administrative capabilities. The Mongols had learned to govern large settled populations effectively, extract resources efficiently, while maintaining economic productivity, and integrate Chinese governmental and military innovations into their own systems. The establishment of effective Mongol administration in northern China provided both a model for governing other conquered territories and a source of expertise and resources for continued expansion. The administrative systems that the Mongols developed for governing China represented important innovations in imperial governance that would influence later political developments throughout Eurasia. They learned to combine Chinese administrative expertise with Mongol political control, creating hybrid systems that could function effectively across cultural and linguistic boundaries. They also developed new approaches to legal administration, taxation, and military organization that incorporated the best features of both nomadic and sedentary governmental traditions. Perhaps even more dramatically, Ogedai's reign saw the first major Mongol campaigns into Europe, operations that brought Mongol armies to the borders of Western European civilization and demonstrated the global reach of Mongol military power. These campaigns, led by the brilliant General Subutai and other experienced Mongol commanders, achieved stunning successes against European armies and established Mongol authority over much of Eastern Europe, forever changing the political landscape of the continent. The European campaigns represented a natural extension of Mongol expansion westward from their Central Asian conquests, but they also required significant adaptations to new types of terrain, climate, and defensive systems. The forests and rivers of Eastern Europe presented very different challenges from the steppes and deserts where Mongol armies had previously operated, requiring new tactical approaches and logistical arrangements. The cities and fortifications of Europe had different architectural characteristics and defensive capabilities than those the Mongols had encountered in China or Central Asia, demanding continued innovation in siege warfare and urban conquest. The campaigns began with the conquest of the various Russian principalities, a process that took several years and required adaptation to the political fragmentation that characterized the region. Unlike the centralized empires that the Mongols had previously conquered, Russia was divided into numerous independent principalities with complex relationships of alliance, rivalry, and mutual obligation. This fragmentation initially provided advantages for Mongol conquest, as it prevented unified resistance, but it also created administrative challenges that required new approaches to governance and control. The Mongol approach to conquering the Russian principalities demonstrated their continued ability to adapt their military and political strategies to local conditions. They exploited the divisions between different Russian rulers while systematically eliminating any possibility of unified resistance. They also proved as effective in the forests and rivers of Russia as they had been on the steppes and in the deserts, demonstrating the adaptability of their military system and the quality of their leadership under diverse environmental conditions. The siege and capture of Kiev in 1240 represented one of the most significant achievements of the Mongol expansion into Europe. Kiev was not just a major political and military center, but also one of the most important religious and cultural sites in Eastern European Christianity. Its fall demonstrated Mongol capability to overcome even the most formidable defensive positions while establishing their authority over territories that had never before been ruled by steppe peoples. The destruction of Kiev was both thorough and selective, reflecting the Mongol approach to conquest that combined devastating military action with practical considerations for future governance and economic productivity. The city's military and political infrastructure was systematically destroyed, eliminating any possibility of organized resistance, while useful economic and administrative capabilities were preserved for incorporation into the Mongol system. This selective approach to destruction would become a characteristic feature of Mongol conquest throughout their expansion. From their base in conquered Russian territories, Mongol armies pushed further west into Poland and Hungary, achieving decisive victories against the military forces of these kingdoms, and demonstrating that Western European military systems were no more effective against Mongol tactics than those of China, Central Asia, or Eastern Europe had been. The battles of Moshi and Legnica in 1241 showed that Mongol military superiority was not limited to specific regions or types of opponents, but represented a fundamental advantage in military organization, tactics, and leadership. The Battle of Moshi, fought against Hungarian forces in April 1241, was particularly significant for what it revealed about Mongol tactical evolution and their ability to adapt to different types of opponents and terrain. The Hungarians had attempted to use the geographic advantages of their homeland to limit Mongol mobility while concentrating their forces for a decisive confrontation. However, the Mongols demonstrated their characteristic tactical flexibility, using feigned retreats, coordinated attacks from multiple directions, and superior mobility to achieve a crushing victory that effectively ended organized Hungarian resistance. The Battle of Legnica, fought against a coalition of Polish and other European forces, demonstrated similar Mongol advantages in coordination, mobility, and tactical innovation. The European forces had attempted to use traditional heavy cavalry tactics that had proven effective in previous European conflicts, but these proved completely inadequate against Mongol tactics that emphasized speed, coordination, and the ability to maintain effective combat capability while remaining highly mobile. These European victories had profound implications beyond their immediate military significance. They demonstrated that Mongol military capabilities were not dependent on specific geographical or cultural conditions, but represented innovations in military organization and tactics that provided fundamental advantages over any contemporary military system. The success of these campaigns established the Mongol Empire as a truly global power with the capability to project military force effectively across the entire breadth of Eurasia. The sudden halt of Mongol expansion into Western Europe following Ögedei's death in 1241 was one of the great turning points in world history. Mongol armies that had seemed unstoppable were recalled to Mongolia for the succession Kurultai, and by the time the succession was settled, other priorities had emerged that directed Mongol attention away from further European conquests. Western Europe thus escaped conquest not through successful resistance, but through the internal political dynamics of the Mongol Empire and the competing demands of governing and expanding in multiple directions simultaneously. The European campaigns, even though they were ultimately not completed, had lasting effects on both European and Mongol development. For Europe, the Mongol invasions demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional defensive systems and political structures, leading to important innovations in military organization, fortification design, and political coordination. For the Mongols, the European campaigns provided valuable experience in governing diverse populations and dealing with different religious and cultural traditions that would influence later imperial policies. The succession, following Ögedei's death, revealed both the strengths and the potential weaknesses of the Mongol political system that Genghis Khan had established. While the empire remained unified and continued to function effectively, the process of selecting a new great Khan proved complex and time-consuming. Different branches of the Mongol royal family had different interests and priorities, and balancing these while maintaining effective central coordination became increasingly challenging as the empire continued to grow in size and complexity. The succession crisis that followed Ögedei's death lasted several years and involved complex negotiations between different factions of the Mongol leadership. This period revealed the tensions that existed between different approaches to imperial governance and expansion. Some leaders favored continued aggressive expansion, while others believed that consolidation and development of existing territories should take priority. Some emphasized traditional Mongol values and practices, while others advocated for greater adaptation to the customs and traditions of conquered populations. Eventually, Ögedei's son Guyuk was selected as Great Khan, but his reign was brief and marked by increasing tensions between different branches of the Mongol leadership. His death in 1248 led to another succession crisis that was finally resolved with the selection of Menki Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, through his son Tolui. These succession crises, while ultimately resolved without permanent damage to imperial unity, highlighted the challenges inherent in maintaining political coordination across such vast territories with such diverse populations and interests. Munga's reign from 1251 to 1259 marked a new phase in Mongol expansion, characterized by simultaneous major campaigns in multiple directions and continued administrative innovations that reflected the growing sophistication of Mongol governmental systems. Under his leadership, the empire demonstrated its ability to coordinate massive military operations across thousands of miles while maintaining effective governance in conquered territories and continuing to adapt to the challenges of ruling diverse populations. Under Mongol Khan, the Mongol Empire reached perhaps the peak of its military effectiveness and territorial expansion. Major campaigns were launched simultaneously against the Song dynasty in southern China and against the Islamic powers of the Middle East, while existing territories were more thoroughly integrated into Mongol administrative systems. These campaigns demonstrated the empire's ability to coordinate massive military operations across thousands of miles while maintaining effective governance in conquered territories. The campaign against the Song dynasty represented the most challenging military operation the Mongols had yet undertaken. The Song controlled the wealthiest and most populous regions of China, with sophisticated military technology, extensive defensive systems, and the resources to sustain prolonged resistance. The Song had also learned from the earlier Mongol conquests of northern China, adapting their defensive strategies and military organization to counter known Mongol tactics and capabilities. The geographical and strategic challenges of conquering the Song territories were formidable. Southern China was characterized by river systems, mountainous terrain, and dense populations that limited the effectiveness of traditional Mongol cavalry tactics. The Song had developed sophisticated naval capabilities and water-based defensive systems that the Mongols had not previously encountered. The region's economic productivity and population density also meant that conquest and governance would require administrative capabilities and resources on an unprecedented scale. The Mongol approach to the Song conquest demonstrated their continued ability to innovate and adapt to new challenges. They developed naval capabilities, learned to fight effectively in riverine and mountainous terrain, and created siege techniques specifically designed to overcome Song defensive innovations. They also developed new approaches to logistics and supply that could support extended campaigns in regions where traditional nomadic practices of living off the land were not sufficient. The conquest of the Song would ultimately take decades and require innovations in naval warfare, siege techniques, and the administration of densely populated agricultural regions. The campaigns revealed both the strengths and limitations of Mongol military systems, while providing crucial experience in governing the most economically productive and technologically advanced regions of the known world. The eventual success of these campaigns would establish the Mongol Empire as the undisputed master of East Asia and provide resources that would support continued expansion in other directions. Simultaneously, Mongol armies under Mongke's brother Hulagu were achieving dramatic successes in the Middle East, conquering the remaining centers of Islamic power in the region and establishing Mongol authority over territories that had been outside steppe control for centuries. These campaigns brought the Mongols into contact with some of the most sophisticated military, political, and cultural systems in the contemporary world, requiring continued adaptation and innovation in Mongol approaches to conquest and governance. The Middle Eastern campaigns represented a different type of challenge from those the Mongols had faced in China or Europe. The Islamic world had different political structures, with the Abbasid Caliphate representing both temporal and spiritual authority for much of the Islamic world. The region had different military traditions, architectural characteristics, and cultural practices that required new approaches to conquest and administration. The economic systems of the Middle East were also different, based on different combinations of agriculture, trade, and urban manufacturing that required new approaches to taxation and resource extraction. The fall of Baghdad in 1258, which ended the Abbasid Caliphate, marked one of the most significant political transformations in Islamic history and demonstrated Mongol ability to operate effectively in yet another cultural and geographical environment. The siege and conquest of Baghdad required sophisticated siege techniques, careful coordination of multiple armies, and strategic planning that took into account the city's significance as both a political center and a symbol of Islamic civilization. The destruction of Baghdad was both thorough and symbolic, designed to eliminate not just military and political resistance, but also the ideological foundations that might support future opposition to Mongol rule. The execution of the last Abbasid Caliph ended a political and religious institution that had existed for over 5 centuries, fundamentally altering the political landscape of the Islamic world. Yet even in this campaign, renowned for its destructiveness, the Mongols demonstrated their practical approach to conquest by preserving useful economic and administrative capabilities while eliminating sources of potential resistance. These Middle Eastern campaigns brought the Mongols into contact with new enemies and new challenges that further expanded their military and administrative capabilities. The Islamic world had different legal traditions, administrative practices, and cultural characteristics than the Chinese or European civilizations the Mongols had previously conquered. Yet once again, the Mongol military and administrative systems proved adaptable, incorporating local expertise while maintaining the essential elements that had made Mongol expansion so successful. The administrative challenges of governing the Middle Eastern territories were particularly complex, requiring the Mongols to work with Islamic legal traditions, manage diverse religious communities, and maintain the economic systems that supported some of the world's most important commercial centers. The solutions they developed influenced later Islamic political development and demonstrated the flexibility of Mongol governmental systems in adapting to different cultural and legal frameworks. The economic implications of Mongol conquest in the Middle East were profound and lasting. The region contains some of the most important trade routes and commercial centers in the world, and bringing them under unified political control created new opportunities for economic integration and development. The Mongols developed new approaches to trade regulation and commercial policy that facilitated exchange across cultural and religious boundaries, while extracting resources needed to support continued military operations. The death of Mongol Khan in 1259, reportedly from dysentery, while campaigning in China, marked the end of the period of unified Mongol expansion and the beginning of a new phase in which the empire gradually divided into separate khanates that, while maintaining nominal unity, increasingly operated as independent powers. This division was partly the natural result of the empire's enormous size and the practical impossibility of maintaining direct central control over such vast territories with such diverse populations and interests. The succession following Munga's death was particularly contentious, with different branches of the Mongol royal family supporting different candidates and different regions having different preferences for future policies and priorities. The competition was primarily between Munga's brothers Kublai and Erik Bokeh, who represented different approaches to imperial governance and different visions for the future development of the Mongol Empire. Kublai Khan represented an approach that emphasized adaptation to local conditions and the integration of Mongol rule with existing governmental and cultural systems. His power base was primarily in China, where he had been serving as Menghi's representative and had gained extensive experience in governing settled populations using Chinese administrative methods. His approach reflected a belief that the empire's future lay in effective governance of conquered territories rather than continued expansion. Arik Boke, by contrast, represented a more traditional approach that emphasized Mongol identity and customs. His power base was in the traditional Mongol heartland, and he advocated for policies that would preserve Mongol cultural distinctiveness and political practices. His approach reflected concerns that excessive adaptation to local conditions would ultimately undermine Mongol unity and identity. The civil war that resulted from the succession dispute lasted several years and involved military campaigns across much of the empire. While Kublai ultimately emerged victorious and was recognized as Great Khan, the conflict had lasting effects on imperial unity and coordination. The eventual selection of Kublai Khan as Great Khan was not universally accepted, and his reign marked the beginning of a period in which the theoretical unity of the Mongol Empire was increasingly challenged by practical independence in different regions. Kublai Khan, who ruled as Great Khan from 1260 to 1294, represented a new type of Mongol leader, one who was as much Chinese emperor as Mongol Khan. His reign was marked by the completion of the conquest of the Song dynasty and the establishment of the Yuan dynasty in China, but also by the increasing autonomy of other parts of the Mongol Empire and the gradual transformation of Mongol rule from nomadic conquest to settled administration. The establishment of the Yuan dynasty represented perhaps the most complete integration of Mongol and Chinese governmental systems that occurred anywhere in the empire. Kublai Khan adopted many aspects of traditional Chinese imperial administration while maintaining Mongol military and political control, creating a synthesis that combined the legitimacy and efficiency of Chinese governmental traditions with the military effectiveness and political unity that had made Mongol conquest possible. Under Kublai Khan's rule, the Mongol Empire in East Asia reached new heights of cultural and economic achievement that rivaled any contemporary civilization. The Yuan dynasty oversaw a period of remarkable artistic and technological innovation, extensive trade connections that linked China to the rest of the Mongol Empire and beyond, and governmental systems that effectively integrated Chinese and Mongol administrative traditions while maintaining the military capabilities needed to defend and expand imperial territories. The capital at Khanbalik, modern Beijing, became one of the great cities of the world under Yuan rule, rivaling any contemporary center in terms of size, wealth, cultural sophistication, and international connections. The city served as both the administrative center of the Chinese Empire and a crucial node in the trade networks that connected East Asia to Central Asia, the Middle East, and ultimately Europe. The cultural and technological achievements of Yuan China influenced development throughout Eurasia and provided models that would be emulated by later dynasties and empires. The completion of the Song conquest under Kublai's leadership required the development of military and administrative capabilities that had not been necessary for earlier Mongol conquests. The Song territories included some of the most economically productive and technologically advanced regions in the world, with complex urban centers, sophisticated manufacturing capabilities, and administrative systems that had been developed over centuries of Chinese governmental innovation. The naval warfare that characterized much of the Song conquest represented a particular innovation in Mongol military capabilities. Traditional Mongol warfare had been based on cavalry tactics and land-based operations, but conquering southern China required the development of significant naval capabilities and the ability to conduct amphibious operations. The Mongols learned to build and operate river fleets, coordinate land and naval operations, and conduct sieges of cities that could be supplied and reinforced by water. The administrative integration of Song territories into the Yuan Empire required the development of governmental systems that could function effectively across the entire breadth of China while maintaining the military and political control that had made Mongol conquest possible. This integration represented one of the great achievements in the history of imperial administration, creating unified political control over a territory that included hundreds of millions of people with diverse languages, cultures, and economic systems. Yet even as the Yuan dynasty flourished under Kublai Khan's rule, other parts of the Mongol Empire were developing in different directions that reflected both the enormous diversity of territories under Mongol control and the practical impossibility of maintaining uniform policies across such vast distances and cultural differences. The Ilkhanate in Persia, established by Hulagu and his descendants, adapted to the Islamic and Persian cultural environment while maintaining Mongol political control. The Golden Horde in Russia developed its own distinctive synthesis of Mongol, Turkic, and Slavic elements. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia remained closer to traditional Mongol practices, but also adapted to local conditions and opportunities. This regionalization of the Mongol Empire was not necessarily a sign of weakness or failure, but rather a natural adaptation to the enormous cultural, geographical, and administrative diversity of the territories under Mongol control. Each region faced different challenges and opportunities, and the flexibility that had always characterized Mongol leadership allowed for different solutions and approaches in different areas. The various khanates maintained family relationships, cultural connections, and some coordination of policies, but they increasingly operated as independent political entities with their own priorities and interests. The Ilkhanate in Persia represented one of the most successful adaptations of Mongol rule to local conditions and cultural traditions. The Ilkhans learned to work within Persian and Islamic governmental traditions while maintaining the military effectiveness and political unity that had made Mongol conquest possible. They patronized Persian literature and art, supported Islamic religious institutions, and developed administrative systems that combined Mongol political control with Persian cultural sophistication. The economic achievements of the Ilkhanate were particularly impressive, as the region became one of the most prosperous parts of the former Mongol Empire. The Ilkhans developed trade policies that facilitated commerce across their territories while extracting resources needed to support military and administrative operations. They also patronized agricultural development, urban construction, and technological innovation that contributed to economic growth and cultural development throughout their territories. The Golden Horde in Russia developed a different but equally successful approach to governing conquered territories while maintaining Mongol identity and political control. The Golden Horde maintained closer connections to traditional nomadic practices while adapting to the geographical and political conditions of Eastern Europe. They developed tributary relationships with Russian principalities that allowed for local autonomy while ensuring political loyalty and economic support for Mongol rule. The administrative system developed by the Golden Horde represented an innovative approach to governing settled populations while maintaining nomadic flexibility and military capabilities. They established permanent administrative centers while maintaining the mobility that had always been crucial to Mongol military effectiveness. They also developed new approaches to taxation and resource extraction that could function effectively across the diverse populations and economic systems of their territories. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia remained closest to traditional Mongol practices and values, partly because the geographical and cultural characteristics of the region were most similar to the original Mongol homeland. However, even the Chagatai Khans adapted to local conditions and opportunities, developing new approaches to governing the settled populations of Central Asian cities while maintaining control over the nomadic populations that continued to be important in the region. The economic impact of Mongol expansion during this period of regionalization was profound and lasting. The Mongol Empire had created the largest free trade zone in history up to that point, with secure trade routes stretching from China to Europe and administrative systems that facilitated commerce across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The famous Silk Road reached its peak of activity during the Mongol period, carrying not just goods, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural influences across the breadth of Eurasia. This economic integration had effects far beyond simple commercial exchange. Technologies developed in one part of the Mongol Empire quickly spread to other regions, accelerating innovation and development across Eurasia. Printing technology from China, astronomical instruments from the Islamic world, and military innovations from various regions all spread rapidly through Mongol trade networks. Ideas and cultural practices also moved along trade routes, creating new syntheses and adaptations that enriched civilizations throughout the Mongol domains. The religious policies of the Mongol Empire also had profound and lasting effects on the development of Eurasian civilizations. Unlike many conquerors, the Mongols generally practiced religious tolerance, allowing conquered peoples to maintain their traditional beliefs and practices while sometimes adopting elements of local religions themselves. This policy was partly practical, recognizing that religious persecution could provoke resistance and instability, but it also reflected genuine Mongol openness to different spiritual traditions and their potential benefits. This religious tolerance had several important consequences for the cultural development of Eurasia. It prevented the kind of religious conflicts that might have destabilized Mongol rule and allowed for the preservation and development of diverse religious traditions under Mongol protection. It also facilitated the exchange of religious ideas across the empire, leading to new syntheses and adaptations that enriched spiritual traditions throughout the region. Buddhism experienced a particular revival under Mongol patronage, with various Mongol rulers supporting Buddhist institutions and practices. This support led to increased contact between different Buddhist traditions and the development of new forms of Buddhist practice that incorporated elements from various regional traditions. The Mongols also facilitated contact between Buddhist and other religious traditions, leading to philosophical and theological exchanges that influenced religious development throughout Eurasia. Christianity also benefited from Mongol religious tolerance, with various Christian communities receiving protection and support from Mongol rulers. The Mongols were particularly interested in Nestorian Christianity, which had already established communities throughout Central Asia and China. This support led to increased Christian missionary activity and the establishment of new Christian communities in regions where they had not previously existed. Islam continued to be practiced and developed under Mongol rule, with many Mongol rulers eventually converting to Islam and supporting Islamic institutions and scholarship. The interaction between Islamic and Mongol traditions led to new forms of Islamic political theory and practice that influenced later Islamic political development. The Mongols also facilitated increased contact between different Islamic traditions and schools of thought, leading to intellectual exchanges that enriched Islamic scholarship and theology. Yet the Mongol Empire, for all its achievements in creating political unity and facilitating cultural exchange, also faced inherent challenges that would ultimately limit its duration as a unified political entity. The enormous distances involved in governing territories from Korea to Poland created communication and coordination problems that became increasingly difficult to manage as the empire matured and the volume of administrative business increased. Different regions developed different interests and priorities that sometimes conflicted with central policies or the interests of other regions. The economic systems of China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe had different characteristics and requirements that made uniform policies increasingly impractical. The cultural differences between different parts of the empire also became more pronounced over time as Mongol rulers adapted to local conditions and became more integrated into regional societies. The gradual adoption of local cultural practices by Mongol rulers in different regions, while helping to legitimize their rule and improve their effectiveness as governors, also tended to reduce their identification with the broader Mongol Empire and increase their focus on regional concerns. Mongol rulers in China became more Chinese in their outlook and priorities. Those in Persia became more Persian, and those in Russia became more integrated into Eastern European political systems. This cultural adaptation, while often successful in creating stable and effective local governance, tended to weaken the bonds that held the empire together as a unified political entity. These centrifugal forces were strengthened by succession disputes and conflicts within the Mongol royal family that became more frequent and more disruptive as the empire aged and the number of potential claimants to various positions increased. Disputes over succession sometimes led to civil wars that weakened central authority and encouraged regional autonomy as local leaders sought to protect their own interests during periods of political uncertainty. The military advantages that had made Mongol conquest possible also gradually eroded as the empire became more settled and administrative. The adoption of settled governmental practices, while necessary for governing agricultural populations effectively, gradually reduced the mobility and unity that had been the traditional strengths of Mongol military systems. Mongol armies became less mobile, less unified, and less different from the military forces of their neighbors and subjects. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had effectively divided into four separate khanates that maintained nominal unity and family connections, but operated increasingly as independent powers with their own policies, priorities, and relationships with neighboring powers. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Yue Khanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia each developed their own approaches to governance, military organization, and cultural development while maintaining some coordination in areas of mutual interest. This division marked the beginning of the gradual decline of Mongol power, though the process would take centuries and would occur at different rates in different regions. The various Mongol khanates continued to be major powers in their respective regions for generations, but they no longer represented the unified political force that had characterized the empire at its peak. The Yuan dynasty in China would last until 1368, when it was overthrown by the Ming dynasty. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed in the 1330s, fragmenting into various successor states. The Golden Horde maintained control over much of Russia until the late 15th century, while various Mongol and Turkic states continued to rule parts of Central Asia into the modern period. The reasons for the eventual decline of Mongol power were complex and varied by region, but several common factors can be identified across the different parts of the former empire. The adoption of settled administrative practices, while necessary for governing agricultural populations, gradually reduced the military advantages that had made Mongol conquest possible. The integration of Mongol elites into local societies also reduced their distinctiveness and their commitment to maintaining Mongol political unity across vast distances and cultural differences. Population dynamics also played a crucial role in Mongol decline. The Mongol population was always small relative to the territories they controlled, and over time, intermarriage and cultural assimilation reduced the size and distinctiveness of Mongol communities in many regions. Without a large population base to maintain their political and military systems, Mongol rulers became increasingly dependent on local populations and local administrative practices, which naturally led to greater integration with local societies and reduced identification with broader Mongol imperial goals. Economic changes also contributed to the decline of Mongol power over time. The trade routes that had provided much of the wealth supporting Mongol administration faced increasing competition from maritime routes, particularly as European powers developed new shipping technologies and established direct commercial relationships with Asian producers. The wealth that had supported Mongol political unity gradually shifted to new centers and new systems, reducing the resources available to maintain the complex administrative and military systems that had made Mongol rule possible. The development of new military technologies also reduced the advantages that had made Mongol conquest possible. The introduction of gunpowder weapons, improvements in fortification design, and the development of new tactical approaches by settled armies gradually eroded the military superiority that had been the foundation of Mongol power. As their military advantages diminished, Mongol rulers found it increasingly difficult to maintain political control over large territories with diverse and potentially hostile populations. Yet even as Mongol political power declined in various regions, the cultural, economic, and technological legacy of the Mongol Empire continued to shape Eurasia for centuries after the end of unified Mongol rule. The trade networks established during the Mongol period continued to function long after Mongol political unity ended, facilitating continued exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies across the breadth of Eurasia. The governmental innovations developed by Mongol administrators influenced political systems throughout Eurasia, providing models and precedents that would be adopted and adapted by later rulers and political systems. The cultural exchanges facilitated by Mongol rule created new syntheses and traditions that enriched civilizations across the continent and continued to influence cultural development long after the end of Mongol political control. The technological transfers that occurred during the Mongol period accelerated innovation and development throughout Eurasia, contributing to the emergence of new capabilities and knowledge that would influence global development for centuries. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol Empire had demonstrated that it was possible to create political unity across the breadth of Eurasia and to govern effectively across enormous cultural and geographical diversity. This precedent would influence later empire builders and political theorists, providing both inspiration and practical models for those who sought to create large-scale political unity. The Mongol example showed that effective governance could transcend traditional boundaries of culture, language, and political tradition, creating new possibilities for human political organization. The military innovations of the Mongol Empire also had lasting influence on military thinking and practice throughout Eurasia and beyond. The emphasis on mobility, coordination, and adaptability that characterized Mongol military practice influenced military development in many regions, contributing to innovations in cavalry tactics, siege warfare, and military organization that would be studied and emulated for centuries. The Mongol synthesis of traditional steppe cavalry tactics with siege warfare, naval operations, and the administration of conquered territories created new models of military organization that demonstrated the possibilities for combining different military traditions and capabilities into more effective and flexible military systems. In terms of technology transfer, the Mongol Empire accelerated the spread of innovations across Eurasia in ways that would have lasting consequences for global development. Gunpowder, printing, navigation techniques, medical knowledge, and countless other innovations spread more rapidly because of Mongol trade networks and administrative connections. This technological exchange contributed to the acceleration of development that would eventually lead to the age of global exploration and the emergence of the modern world system. The Mongol approach to governance also left important legacies that would influence political development in many regions. Their emphasis on merit over birth, their religious tolerance, their systematic approach to administration, and their integration of diverse cultural traditions created models that would influence governmental development throughout Eurasia. The Mongol demonstration that effective administration could incorporate the best practices of different civilizations provided important precedents for later multicultural empires and political systems. Even the eventual fragmentation of the Mongol Empire contributed to historical development in important ways. The various successor states that emerged from Mongol rule carried forward different aspects of Mongol governmental, military, and cultural innovations, adapting them to local conditions and creating new syntheses that enriched regional development. The diversity of these developments contributed to the overall dynamism of Eurasian civilization during the later medieval period and provided foundations for subsequent political and cultural innovations. The demographic and ecological consequences of Mongol expansion were also significant and lasting, influencing population patterns, agricultural practices, and environmental conditions across much of Eurasia. The movements of peoples facilitated by Mongol rule, the establishment of new trade connections, and the exchange of agricultural and technological practices had effects that extended far beyond the political duration of the empire and contributed to long-term changes in settlement patterns, economic development, and cultural practices. In Central Asia, the heartland of the original Mongol Empire, the legacy of Mongol rule was particularly complex and enduring. While political unity was never fully restored after the fragmentation of the empire, the cultural and social changes introduced during the Mongol period continued to influence regional development for centuries. The integration of different nomadic groups under Mongol rule, the establishment of new trade relationships, and the synthesis of Mongol with local governmental practices created foundations for later political and cultural developments in the region. The influence of the Mongol Empire on global historical development extends even to the modern period, providing precedents and examples that continue to influence political thinking and international relations. The precedent of Eurasian political unity, the models of multicultural administration, and the demonstration of the possibilities for large-scale economic and cultural integration provided important historical examples for later political developments and continue to be studied by scholars and political leaders seeking to understand the possibilities and challenges of large-scale political organization. Perhaps most fundamentally, the Mongol Empire represents one of humanity's great experiments in political organization and cultural integration, starting from the nomadic traditions of the Mongolian steppes. It created governmental, military, and economic systems that could function effectively across the breadth of Eurasia, demonstrating the potential for human societies to transcend traditional boundaries of culture, geography, and political organization to create new forms of unity and cooperation. The story of the Mongol Empire is thus not simply a tale of conquest and decline, but a complex narrative of adaptation, innovation, and historical transformation that shows how a relatively small population, through exceptional leadership, organizational innovation, and cultural flexibility, could reshape the political and economic landscape of the largest continent on Earth. It demonstrates both the possibilities and the challenges inherent in creating large-scale political unity across cultural and geographical diversity. As we reflect on this remarkable chapter in human history, we can appreciate both the achievements and the limitations of the Mongol Empire, while recognizing its continuing relevance for understanding the possibilities and challenges of political organization in our contemporary interconnected world. Its success in creating unprecedented political unity and facilitating cultural and economic exchange represents one of the great accomplishments in human political organization, while its eventual fragmentation reminds us of the difficulties inherent in maintaining large-scale political systems across diverse populations and vast territories. Yet the legacy of the Mongol Empire extends far beyond its political duration, encompassing the connections it created, the precedents it established, and the innovations it fostered that continued to influence human development long after Mongol political power had waned. In this sense, the Mongol Empire succeeded in achieving a form of permanence that transcends political boundaries and temporal limitations, contributing to the development of the interconnected world system that characterizes our contemporary global civilization. The vast steppes of Mongolia, where this great story began, remain much as they were 8 centuries ago, windswept grasslands under an enormous sky, where the rhythm of seasons still governs the movements of herders and their animals. Yet these landscapes witness the birth of something unprecedented in human history, a political and cultural synthesis that connected civilizations across thousands of miles and created new possibilities for human cooperation and exchange that continue to influence global development today. From these humble beginnings emerged an empire that fundamentally changed the trajectory of global development, demonstrating that human political organization could transcend traditional limitations and create new forms of unity across seemingly insurmountable barriers of distance, culture, and tradition. The Mongol Empire thus stands as one of humanity's great achievements in political innovation and cultural integration, a testament to the possibilities inherent in human cooperation and the enduring power of exceptional leadership to transform the conditions of historical development. The individual stories of the later Mongol Khanes reveal the diverse ways in which Mongol innovations continued to influence regional development long after the end of unified imperial rule. In China, the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan's successors continued to govern the world's most populous empire for over a century, creating governmental systems that would influence Chinese political development for generations. The Yuan period saw remarkable achievements in literature, art, and technology, including the development of new forms of drama, innovations in printing and publishing, and architectural achievements that combined Chinese and Mongol design elements. The Yuan dynasty's approach to governing China represented one of the most successful examples of cultural synthesis in imperial history. Mongol rulers learned to work within Chinese governmental traditions while maintaining their own cultural identity and political priorities. They patronized Chinese scholars and artists while also supporting cultural exchanges with other parts of the Mongol world. This synthesis created new forms of cultural expression that enriched both Chinese and Mongol traditions. The economic policies of the Yuan dynasty were particularly innovative, creating new approaches to taxation, trade regulation, and monetary policy that facilitated commerce while supporting governmental operations. The dynasty's promotion of trade and technological innovation contributed to economic growth and cultural development throughout East Asia. The Yuan period also saw increased contact between China and other parts of the world, facilitated by the trade networks and diplomatic connections that had been established during the period of unified Mongol rule. The eventual fall of the Yuan dynasty in 1368 resulted from a combination of factors, including natural disasters, economic pressures, and the gradual loss of military effectiveness that characterized the later period of Mongol rule in China. The Ming dynasty that replaced the Yuan adopted many governmental innovations that had been developed during the Mongol period, while rejecting others, creating a new synthesis that combined Chinese traditions with selected Mongol administrative practices. In Persia, the Ilkhanate developed in different directions that reflected both the Islamic cultural environment and the specific challenges of governing the Middle Eastern territories. The Ilkhans gradually converted to Islam and adopted Persian cultural practices while maintaining their Mongol political and military organization. This synthesis created new forms of Islamic political theory and practice that influenced later Middle Eastern development. The Ilkhanate period saw remarkable achievements in Persian literature, art, and architecture that combined Islamic, Persian, and Mongol elements. The patronage provided by Mongol rulers supported the development of new literary forms, architectural innovations, and artistic traditions that enriched Persian culture. The period also saw increased contact between Persian and other cultural traditions, facilitated by the trade networks and administrative connections that linked the Ilkhanate to other parts of the former Mongol Empire. The economic policies of the Ilkhanate were designed to support both military operations and cultural development while maintaining the trade relationships that were crucial for the region's prosperity. The Ilkhans developed new approaches to taxation and administration that could function effectively within Islamic legal frameworks while supporting the complex governmental and military systems that were necessary for maintaining control over their diverse territories. The collapse of the Ilkhanate in the 1330s resulted from succession disputes, economic pressures, and the gradual fragmentation of political authority that characterized many of the later Mongol states. The successor states that emerged from the Ilkhanate's collapse carried forward many of the governmental and cultural innovations that had been developed during the Mongol period, contributing to the continued development of Islamic political and cultural traditions. In Russia, the Golden Horde developed yet another distinctive approach to Mongol rule that reflected the specific conditions of Eastern Europe and the complex relationships between nomadic and settled populations in the region. The Golden Horde maintained closer connections to traditional nomadic practices while adapting to the political and geographical conditions of their territories. The tributary system that the Golden Horde established with the Russian principalities represented an innovative approach to governing settled populations while maintaining nomadic flexibility and military capabilities. This system allowed for local autonomy while ensuring political loyalty and economic support for Mongol rule. The arrangement proved remarkably durable, lasting for over 2 centuries and influencing the development of Russian political traditions. The Golden Horde period saw significant cultural exchanges between Mongol, Turkic, and Slavic traditions that created new syntheses and adaptations. The interactions between different religious traditions, particularly Islam, Orthodox Christianity, and traditional shamanic practices, led to new forms of cultural expression and religious practice that enriched the cultural landscape of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The economic role of the Golden Horde was particularly important for the development of trade relationships between Europe and Asia. The Horde controlled crucial trade routes and developed commercial policies that facilitated exchange while providing resources needed to support their political and military operations. This commercial activity contributed to economic development throughout Eastern Europe and helped maintain the connections between different parts of the former Mongol Empire. The gradual decline of the Golden Horde occurred over several centuries and involved the slow fragmentation of political authority, the rise of Russian political power, and changes in military technology and economic systems that reduced the advantages that had made Mongol rule possible. The process culminated in the late 15th century with the emergence of independent Russian political authority. The Mongol successor states continued to exist in various forms well into the modern period. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate developed in ways that reflected both its proximity to the original Mongol heartland and the specific conditions of the region's diverse populations and economic systems. The Chagatai Khans maintained closer connections to traditional Mongol practices while adapting to the needs of governing both nomadic and settled populations across a vast and geographically diverse territory. The Chagatai Khanate's approach to governing Central Asia represented a distinctive synthesis of nomadic and settled governmental practices that influenced regional political development for centuries. The Khans developed administrative systems that could function effectively across the diverse populations and economic systems of their territories, while maintaining the military capabilities needed to defend and expand their domains. The cultural development of the Chagatai Khanate was influenced by the interactions between Mongol, Turkic, Persian, and Islamic traditions that created new forms of cultural expression and political organization. The period saw significant developments in literature, particularly in Turkic languages, and architectural innovations that combined elements from various cultural traditions. The economic role of the Chagatai Khanate was crucial for maintaining the trade networks that connected east and west across Central Asia. The Khans developed commercial policies that facilitated trade while providing resources needed to support their governmental and military operations. This commercial activity helped maintain Central Asia's position as a crucial link between different parts of Eurasia. The fragmentation of the Chagatai Khanate occurred gradually over several centuries, resulting in the emergence of various successor states that carried forward different aspects of Mongol political and cultural innovations. These successor states continued to influence Central Asian development well into the modern period, contributing to the region's distinctive political and cultural characteristics. The scholarly and intellectual legacy of the Mongol Empire represents another crucial dimension of its historical significance. The cultural exchanges facilitated by Mongol rule led to unprecedented transfers of knowledge, ideas, and intellectual traditions across Eurasia. Scholars, scientists, artists, and religious thinkers traveled throughout the empire, creating new syntheses and adaptations that enriched intellectual development across multiple civilizations. The Mongol patronage of learning and scholarship was particularly significant in promoting cross-cultural intellectual exchange. Mongol rulers supported scholars and institutions that preserved and developed knowledge from various traditions while encouraging innovations that combined different intellectual approaches. This support led to advances in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and other fields that had lasting influence on global intellectual development. The preservation and transmission of historical knowledge during the Mongol period was also crucial for our understanding of medieval Eurasian history. Mongol-sponsored historical works, including both official chronicles and independent scholarly investigations, provide invaluable sources for understanding the development of various civilizations during this crucial period. The Mongol emphasis on record-keeping and documentation created archival traditions that preserved knowledge about governmental practices, cultural developments, and historical events. The linguistic and literary developments that occurred during the Mongol period had profound and lasting effects on cultural development throughout Eurasia. The interactions between different linguistic traditions led to new forms of literary expression, the development of new writing systems, and the creation of literary works that combined elements from various cultural traditions. These literary innovations influenced cultural development in many regions for centuries after the end of Mongol political control. The technological legacy of the Mongol Empire encompasses both the innovations that were developed during the period of Mongol rule and the acceleration of technological transfer that occurred because of Mongol trade networks and administrative connections. The empire facilitated the rapid spread of technologies like gunpowder, printing, navigation instruments, and agricultural innovations that had profound effects on global development. The military technologies that were developed or refined during the Mongol period had particular significance for later military development. Innovations in siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and military organization influenced military thinking throughout Eurasia and contributed to the development of new military systems that would shape warfare for centuries. The Mongol synthesis of different military traditions created new possibilities for combining various tactical approaches and military technologies. The agricultural and environmental impacts of Mongol expansion were also significant and lasting. The movements of peoples and animals that accompanied Mongol expansion led to the introduction of new crops, livestock breeds, and agricultural techniques across Eurasia. These agricultural exchanges contributed to population growth in some regions and the development of new economic systems that supported larger and more complex societies. The environmental consequences of Mongol expansion included both destructive and constructive elements. While some regions experienced significant environmental damage from warfare and population movements, others benefited from improved agricultural techniques, better resource management, and the establishment of conservation practices that protected important ecological resources. The diplomatic and international relations practices developed during the Mongol period established precedents and models that influenced later international political development. The Mongol approach to diplomacy, which emphasized practical relationships over ideological considerations, created new possibilities for international cooperation and conflict resolution. The diplomatic innovations of the Mongol period contributed to the development of international law and diplomatic practice that continue to influence contemporary international relations. The legal and constitutional legacy of the Mongol Empire encompasses both the specific legal innovations that were developed during the period of Mongol rule and the broader constitutional principles that emerged from Mongol governmental practice. The Great Law, or Yasa, established principles of legal uniformity, religious tolerance, and merit-based advancement that influenced constitutional development in many regions. The Mongol approach to constitutional government, which emphasized practical effectiveness over theoretical consistency, created models for governmental organization that could function effectively across diverse populations and cultural traditions. These constitutional innovations provided precedents for later political developments and contributed to the evolution of governmental systems that could accommodate cultural diversity while maintaining political unity. The commercial and economic legacy of the Mongol Empire had profound and lasting effects on global economic development. The trade networks established during the Mongol period created new patterns of economic exchange that continued long after the end of unified Mongol political control. The commercial innovations developed during this period influenced the development of banking, credit systems, and international trade practices that contributed to the emergence of the modern global economy. The monetary and financial innovations of the Mongol period were particularly significant for later economic development. The Mongols experimented with various forms of currency, credit systems, and taxation methods that created new possibilities for economic coordination across vast distances and diverse economic systems. These financial innovations influenced the development of economic systems throughout Eurasia and contributed to the emergence of more sophisticated approaches to economic management and international commerce. The urban development that occurred during the Mongol period created new models for city planning and urban administration that influenced later urban development throughout Eurasia. Mongol-sponsored cities combined elements from various architectural and planning traditions while incorporating innovations designed to support trade, administration, and cultural exchange. These urban innovations contributed to the development of cities that could function effectively as centers of economic and cultural activity while supporting the complex administrative and military systems needed for imperial governance. The educational and cultural institutions established during the Mongol period had lasting influence on intellectual and cultural development throughout Eurasia. Mongol patronage supported the establishment of schools, libraries, and cultural centers that preserved and developed knowledge from various traditions, while encouraging innovations that combined different intellectual approaches. These institutions continued to influence cultural development long after the end of Mongol political control. The religious and philosophical legacy of the Mongol Empire encompasses both the specific religious developments that occurred during the period of Mongol rule and the broader philosophical principles that emerged from Mongol approaches to governance and cultural interaction. The Mongol practice of religious tolerance created new possibilities for religious and philosophical exchange that enriched spiritual and intellectual traditions throughout Eurasia. The philosophical implications of Mongol political practice, particularly their emphasis on practical effectiveness and cultural adaptation, contributed to the development of new approaches to political theory and governmental practice. The Mongol demonstration that effective governance could incorporate diverse cultural traditions while maintaining political unity provided important precedents for later political philosophers and practitioners. As we consider the full scope of the Mongol Empire's historical significance, we can appreciate both the magnitude of their achievements and the complexity of their legacy. The empire succeeded in creating political unity across a larger territory than any previous or subsequent political entity, while developing governmental, military, and economic systems that could function effectively across enormous cultural and geographical diversity. The innovations developed during the Mongol period in areas ranging from military organization and diplomatic practice to religious tolerance and commercial policy created precedents and models that continue to influence contemporary political and economic development. The Mongol demonstration that human societies could transcend traditional boundaries of culture, geography, and political organization continues to provide inspiration and guidance for those seeking to address the challenges of global governance and international cooperation in our contemporary interconnected world. The ultimate significance of the Mongol Empire lies not just in its territorial extent or military achievements, but in its demonstration of the possibilities inherent in human political organization and cultural cooperation. The empire showed that it was possible to create effective governance across enormous diversity while facilitating cultural exchange and technological development that enriched human civilization throughout Eurasia. The story of the Mongol Empire thus represents one of the great chapters in human political and cultural development, demonstrating both the possibilities and the challenges inherent in creating large-scale political unity while maintaining cultural diversity and local autonomy. Its legacy continues to influence our understanding of international relations, cultural exchange, and the possibilities for human cooperation across traditional boundaries of nationality, culture, and religion. From the windswept steppes, where nomadic herders still follow the ancient rhythms of seasonal migration, to the great cities that preserve the architectural and cultural innovations of the Mongol period, to the trade routes that continue to connect East and West, the influence of the Mongol Empire remains visible in the contemporary world. The political borders, cultural traditions, and economic systems of modern Eurasia all bear the imprint of the great empire that emerged from the unification of the Mongol tribes 8 centuries ago. The lessons of the Mongol Empire about the importance of political vision and effective leadership, about the possibilities for cultural synthesis and adaptation, about the challenges of maintaining unity across diversity, and about the enduring significance of trade and cultural exchange for human development, remain relevant for contemporary global civilization. As we face our own challenges of international cooperation, cultural understanding, and global governance, the example of the Mongol Empire provides both inspiration and instruction about the possibilities and responsibilities that accompany political power and cultural leadership. And so the story of the Mongol Empire, which began with feuding tribes on the steppes of Mongolia, concludes as one of the great chapters in the human story, a demonstration of how political vision, military innovation, and cultural adaptation could create unprecedented unity across the vast expanse of Eurasia, leaving legacies that continue to influence our interconnected world and reminding us of both the possibilities and the responsibilities that come with political power and cultural leadership in an interconnected global civilization. In the end, the Mongol Empire stands as a testament to the remarkable capacity of human societies to transcend traditional limitations and create new possibilities for cooperation, exchange, and mutual understanding across the vast diversity of human experience and cultural expression.